The air at RAF Boscombe Down in the autumn of 1951 was perpetually damp, a chill English fog clinging to the hangars and runways, swallowing sounds and secrets with equal ease. It was here, in the pre-dawn gloom of a classified hangar known only as Shed 8, that a small group of men, engineers in duffel coats, pilots in leather jackets, and a handful of high-ranking officers in greatcoats, stood in a hushed semicircle. Before them, under the stark glare of temporary work lights, sat the future. And the future was terrifyingly beautiful. It was designated the Experimental Aircraft Project 103, but those who knew it called it the Sky Serpent. It was a machine that seemed to defy the very principles of aeronautics as they were then understood. Its wings were swept back at a radical angle, thin as razor blades, looking less like structures for lift and more like daggers designed to slice through the air. Its fuselage was impossibly long and slender, a needle-nosed dart polished to a mirror shine, not with paint, but with experimental aluminum lithium alloys that were lighter and stronger than anything in production. And at its tail, the engine intake gaped like a dark mouth, leading to a power plant so secret its blueprints were said to exist in only 3 copies. This was the Power Jet's W2700s, an early turbojet that produced a raw, tearing howl, a sound that was less an engine noise and more the audible manifestation of pure, unadulterated thrust. The man who had willed this creature into being was Sir Barnes Wallis, the legendary engineer behind the bouncing bomb. Now, his mind was focused on a different problem: altitude and speed. The Cold War was freezing solid, and the intelligence coming from MI6 was grim. The Soviet Union was deploying ever more formidable fleets of long-range bombers, copies of the American B-29, capable of reaching Britain. The RAF's current interceptors, the Gloucester Meteors and de Havilland Vampires, were subsonic. They could not climb fast enough or high enough to intercept a bomber flying at 40,000 feet. Britain, and by extension the West, was becoming vulnerable. The Sky Serpent had one singular, brutal purpose: to fly higher and faster than anything the Soviet Union had ever designed, or even conceived. Its target was not a city or a factory. Its target was an assumption, the Soviet belief in the impenetrability of their own airspace. If the prototype worked, it would expose a terrifying, foundational crack in the USSR's defenses. It would prove that their vast network of radars, anti-aircraft guns, and fledgling jet interceptors was blind to an aircraft that could cruise above 50,000 feet at near supersonic speeds. The Sky Serpent was not just an aircraft, it was a question, poised to be asked in the most provocative way imaginable. The Sky Serpent's test flights were a symphony of controlled terror. The pilots, men with nerves of tungsten, reported control surfaces that became terrifyingly sensitive at the edge of the sound barrier, and engines that flamed out in the thin, frozen air of the stratosphere. The aircraft was a handful, a beast that was only partially tamed. It was nowhere near ready for operational service. Which is why the team at Boscombe Down was stunned when, in early 1952, they received a visit not from the Ministry of Supply, but from a man representing a much more shadowy department. He was from the RAF's Reconnaissance Intelligence Group, a unit so clandestine it didn't officially exist. He didn't talk about performance envelopes or stress tolerances. He talked about gaps. Radar gaps. Using fragmentary intelligence from defectors and electronic eavesdropping from listening posts in Turkey and Iran, British analysts had pieced together a tentative map of the Soviet Union's early warning radar network, known as Strana. They believed there were seams in this network, corridors where an aircraft flying at extreme altitude might pass undetected. But it was a theory, a guess scribbled on a map. They needed proof. The order was delivered to the chief test pilot, a weathered veteran of the Berlin airlift named John McIntyre, in a windowless office. "Take it to the edge of the USSR's radar envelope," the intelligence officer said, his voice devoid of emotion. "The Baltic approach. Don't cross the border. Not even a toe over the line. But show them what we can do. Let them get a glimpse. We need to see how they react. We need to know if they can even see you." The mission was insanity. They were sending a temperamental, unarmed prototype, flown by a man whose life was measured in seconds if anything went wrong, on a flight that could start a war by accident. A single navigational error, a misinterpretation by a twitchy Soviet radar operator, and a MiG-15 could be sent to investigate. The outcome of such a meeting was not in doubt. The Sky Serpent was a racer, not a fighter. McIntyre accepted the mission with a grim nod. He understood the stakes better than anyone. This was not a test flight, it was a provocation. He would be a ghost at the Soviet feast, tapping on their window from 55,000 feet, trying to gauge if the people inside were home. He would be alone, in an unpressurized cockpit, encased in a partial pressure suit, flying an aircraft that was more hypothesis than machine, over some of the most hostile territory on Earth. His only weapons were altitude and speed. His only shield was the hope that Soviet technology was as backward as the intelligence reports suggested. It was a hope that, if wrong, would be the last thing he ever knew. The morning of the flight was crystalline and brutally cold. A thin layer of frost coated the Sky Serpent's wings, making the already alien aircraft look like a creature sculpted from ice. John McIntyre, encased in his bulky, uncomfortable high-altitude pressure suit, was a man preparing for a journey not just across distance but to the very edge of the atmosphere. His breathing was a loud, mechanical rhythm inside his helmet, the pure oxygen sharp in his lungs. The ground crew moved with a funereal seriousness, their usual banter extinguished by the gravity of the mission. This was not a test. This was a foray into the unknown. At 0700 hours, the signal was given. The startup procedure for the W-2700s was a series of escalating, mechanical screams. First, the auxiliary power unit whined to life, a high-pitched complaint. Then, as fuel was introduced and ignited, the engine produced a low, resonant rumble that shook the concrete hardstand. Mac pushed the throttle forward. The response was not a gradual acceleration, but a savage, physical blow. The Sky Serpent didn't roll down the runway, it was hurled along it, the force pressing Mac back into his seat with a violence that made his vision swim. In what felt like an impossibly short distance, the needle nose lifted, and the aircraft lunged upward, its landing gear retracting with a solid, reassuring thud. The climb was not an ascent, it was an attack on the sky itself. The revolutionary engine, gulping thin air through its complex intake system, did not gasp for breath like conventional jets. It thrived on the deprivation. As Mac pointed the nose toward the stratosphere, the power remained relentless, a constant, shoving hand at his back. He watched the altimeter unwind at a dizzying rate, 30,000, 40,000, 50,000 feet. The world outside the curved canopy transformed. The deep blue of the lower sky began to darken into the violet black of near space. The horizon, once a flat line, began to curve. Down below, in a darkened room at RAF Watton, a team of signals intelligence officers monitored a bank of receivers, their ears tuned to Soviet air defense frequencies. The chatter was routine, calm. No painting on Soviet scopes, a sergeant murmured, confirming what Mi-6 had hoped. At 50,000 feet, the Sky Serpent was a ghost, flying above the effective ceiling of the Soviet Union's early warning radars. The radio waves simply passed beneath it. Mac pushed higher. 60,000 feet. Now, the radio eavesdroppers detected a change. The Soviet voices, once bored and procedural, took on a note of confusion. Neponyatny signal, one operator was heard saying, unclear signal. Another reported a bystrakotny contact, a contact without a track. Their systems were seeing something, a flicker, a phantom they couldn't lock onto or classify. It was too high, too fast. It didn't fit the profile of a weather balloon or a bomber. It was an anomaly, and anomalies in the paranoid Soviet air defense system were a cause for alarm. Finally, Mac leveled off at 68,000 feet. He was in a realm reserved for meteors and dreams. The sky was now a profound, star-flecked black, the sun a fierce, unfiltered orb of white light. Below, he could see the gentle, undeniable arc of the earth, a tapestry of cloud and landmass stretched over a sphere. He was alone, suspended between the sky and the void, flying a machine that was, for this brief moment, the highest and fastest thing in the world. The Soviet Union sprawled beneath him, a vast, secretive empire, and its defenders had no idea he was there. The Sky Serpent had not just flown high, it had punched a hole straight through the USSR's technological confidence, a silent, invisible dagger hanging over the motherland. The flicker on the radar screens at the VNOS Wojska Protivovzdushnoi Obrony Strony station near Tallinn was dismissed at first. A ghost, a temperature inversion, a equipment malfunction. But when the same, bystrakotny contact, was reported simultaneously from stations in Leningrad and the Baltic region, all reporting an object at an impossible altitude, the situation escalated from a curiosity to a crisis. Within minutes, the report shot up the chain of command, from the local command post to the Air Defense District headquarters, and finally to the Central Command bunker deep beneath Moscow. The phone on the desk of the Commander-in-Chief of Soviet Air Defense, a man who had survived the purges of the Great Patriotic War, rang with an urgency reserved for nuclear attack. The data was laid before him, a single, fast-moving return, cruising at over 68,000 feet, higher than the service ceiling of the MiG-15, the new MiG-17, and even the secret, still in testing MiG-19. A cold dread filled the bunker. This was not an errant weather balloon. This was a demonstration. The orders were barked into field telephones. Vozdushnaya Trivoga. Parakovachiki v Vozduk. Air alarm. Interceptors airborne. Across the Western Soviet Union, airbase sirens wailed. Pilots, some still finishing their breakfast, sprinted to their waiting MiGs. Engines coughed into life, and a wave of Soviet airpower began to climb, their contrails painting frantic white scratches across the blue sky. The pilots pushed their machines to the limit, climbing at maximum thrust, their own cockpits shuddering as they approached their operational ceilings. But one by one, they stalled out. Their engines, starved of oxygen, flamed out or lost power. Their controls became mushy and unresponsive. They reached their absolute limits, 52,000, 53,000 feet, and could climb no further. They were still thousands of meters below the intruder. Frustrated, humiliated, the Soviet pilots could only orbit below, their necks craned back, staring up into the infinite blue. They saw nothing. The British aircraft was a speck, invisible from their vantage point, a silent, mocking God looking down from its unreachable heaven. Radio transmissions from the interceptors crackled with a mixture of anger and awe. Nishivo ne vidno. I see nothing. Ona slishkom visoko. It is too high. Back in the Moscow bunker, the reality of the situation was sinking in. Their entire integrated air defense network, the radars, the guns, the interceptors, was useless. A single aircraft had just flown a reconnaissance mission along their border, and they had been powerless to stop it, or even to properly identify it. It was a systemic, catastrophic failure. One senior officer, a veteran of Stalingrad who understood the psychology of warfare as well as its mechanics, later wrote in a classified after-action report that was only unearthed after the Cold War, Ito Bilne Samolet. Ito Bilo Predoprezdenie. The translation was as chilling as it was succinct. It was not an aircraft. It was a warning. The message from the British was clear: your borders are an illusion. Your defenses are obsolete. Your skies belong to us. The shockwave from that single, high-altitude flight would reverberate through the halls of the Kremlin for years, triggering a frantic, multi-billion ruble crash program to close the altitude gap that the Sky Serpent had so brutally exposed. The race for the stratosphere was on, and the Soviets had just been left at the starting line. The silence in Mac's cockpit was profound. It was the silence of the void, broken only by the faint, high-frequency hum of the electronics and the rhythmic hiss of his oxygen supply. He had been a spectator at his own demonstration, a god looking down on the futile scrambling of mortals. But the mission was not yet over. The most dangerous phase was about to begin, the return. He was deep in the dragon's den, and the dragon was now awake, angry, and blind. The order crackled in his ear, a voice from the distant operations room, strained with tension. Serpent 1, your window is closing. Execute egress. Now. Mac didn't hesitate. With a firm, smooth motion, he pushed the control column forward. The nose of the Sky Serpent dropped, pointing toward the darker blue of the lower atmosphere. For a moment, the aircraft seemed to hang, suspended between the black of space and the blue of Earth. Then, gravity took hold. He advanced the throttle to its mechanical stop. The W-2700's engine, already operating at the edge of its tolerance, responded with a raw, animalistic surge. The acceleration was not a gradual push, it was a physical blow, a sudden, crushing weight that pressed Mac into his seat. The G-forces mounted, making the blood drain from his head, his vision tunneling. He fought against the gray out, grunting with the strain, his muscles taut. The airspeed indicator, a needle that had been hovering at a respectable but subsonic cruise, began to unwind at a dizzying rate. In the operations room at RAF Watton, a flight engineer stared at the telemetry data streaming in from the aircraft. The numbers on his screen made no sense. He tapped his gauge, thinking it was frozen. "Sir," he said, his voice tight with disbelief, "the data link must be corrupted. It's showing an acceleration profile that's... It's not possible. The rate of climb is negative, but the airspeed... It's building too fast." The senior officer in charge leaned over his shoulder, his face grim. "The link is fine," he said quietly. "The aircraft is just that fast." Below, in the Soviet radar stations, the flickering, elusive blip that had been a source of confusion suddenly transformed. It didn't just move, it streaked. It blossomed into a clear, bright return as the aircraft descended into a denser layer of the atmosphere where radar energy could get a better grip. But its speed was an order of magnitude beyond anything in their identification tables. It was faster than a cannon shell. Operators tracked it with widening eyes, calling out vectors that seemed to defy physics. Skorost, neponyatnaya. Speed incomprehensible. They watched, mesmerized and horrified, as the blip tore a path westward, a digital comet burning across their scopes. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it began to break up. The radar returned fragmented, distorted, and dissolved into a cloud of electronic snow. The Sky Serpent was vanishing, not by stealth, but by sheer velocity and geometry. It was diving into the clutter, the zone where radar beams are bent and scattered by the curvature of the Earth and atmospheric conditions, a no-man's land for tracking systems of the era. One moment it was there, a tangible threat, The next, it was a ghost again, lost in the electronic noise of the planet itself. From engine start to the final fade from Soviet scopes, the entire provocative ballet had lasted less than 15 minutes. But the impact of those minutes would resonate for decades. The Sky Serpent had not just proven a point, it had delivered a masterclass in aerial superiority, a demonstration that would be studied, feared, and used to justify weapons programs for a generation. The mood in the Kremlin that night was not one of anger, but of cold, gut-wrenching fear. The reports from the air defense forces were laid on the polished table before the Politburo and senior military commanders. They were stark, unambiguous, and humiliating. An unidentified aircraft, of presumed British origin, had penetrated their sovereign airspace in all but name, flown at an altitude they could not reach, and departed at a speed they could not match. It had observed them with impunity. The analysts and strategists who met through the long, sleepless night did not see the Sky Serpent as an isolated prototype. They saw it as a harbinger. Their logic, forged in the crucible of paranoia and the brutal realism of the Cold War, was chillingly straightforward. The capitalist powers shared technology. If the British, a second-tier power compared to the Americans, could field one prototype this advanced, then the United States must be years ahead. The terrifying conclusion was inescapable. The Americans were not just building a high-altitude reconnaissance plane. They were building a high-altitude bomber. A space plane that could cross the vast expanse of the USSR at near-space altitude, invulnerable to every interceptor in the Soviet inventory. A weapon that could outrun the sound of its own approach, delivering a nuclear payload on Moscow or Leningrad before their radars could even achieve a firm lock, let alone scramble a meaningful defense. The concept of a strategic warning time, the precious hours needed to get bombers airborne and leaders to bunkers, was rendered null and void by a single flight. Soviet leadership, from Stalin down, responded the only way they knew how, with massive, centralized, and ruthless determination. They rewrote their entire air defense doctrine overnight. The threat was no longer just from formations of subsonic B-29 copies, it was from a single, impossibly fast aircraft flying at the edge of space. A crash program, consuming billions of rubles and the efforts of their best scientific minds, was initiated immediately. The directives were clear and absolute. Design ultra-high altitude interceptors. This led directly to the frantic development of aircraft like the Mikoyan-Gurevich Ye-50 and the Sukhoi T-37, radical designs with rocket boosters and monstrous engines, pushing them toward the Sky Serpent's performance envelope. This race would ultimately culminate in the legendary MiG-25 inches Foxbat, a terrifying interceptor built from stainless steel specifically to hunt high-altitude threats. Build radar capable of tracking edge-of-space intruders. The entire Strana radar network was deemed obsolete. This triggered the development of a new generation of powerful, early warning radars with longer range and higher elevation capabilities, the precursors to the massive systems that would dot the Soviet periphery for the next 40 years. Deploy early warning networks stretching across Siberia. The vulnerability of their western flank exposed the even greater vulnerability of the vast, unguarded Arctic and Siberian approaches. This single flight provided the ultimate justification for the colossal investment in the chain of radars and monitoring stations across the roof of the world. Move R&D funding into aircraft that didn't yet exist on paper. The future of air defense was no longer in incremental improvements, it was in revolutionary leaps. Funding was siphoned from other projects and poured into hypersonics, ramjets, and surface-to-air missiles capable of reaching into the stratosphere. This was the birth of the Soviet, anti-space plane, mindset, a defensive posture that would define their military strategy for the remainder of the Cold War. It was a doctrine built on the fear of a single, unseen aircraft. All of it, the redesigned jets, the new radars, the sprawling early warning networks, the immense financial and human cost, was triggered by one British jet that never fired a shot, never dropped a bomb, and was home in time for tea. Its true weapon was not a cannon, but an idea, the idea of invulnerability, an idea so powerful it forced a superpower to tear up its defense plans and start again. The return of the Sky Serpent to the fog-shrouded secrecy of Shed 8 was an anticlimax wrapped in exhaustion and relief. It was met not by cheering crowds, but by a heavily armed Royal Marine Guard and a team of tight-lipped technicians who swarmed over it, downloading data recorders and refueling it as if it were a radioactive object. John McIntyre, his body aching from the G-forces and the hours spent in the cramped, pressurized cockpit, was debriefed for 6 hours straight in a soundproofed room. He was then given a firm handshake, a week's leave, and a stern reminder of the Official Secrets Act. The flight logs were altered. The aircraft's designation was scrubbed from routine maintenance schedules. It became a non-thing, a ghost in the RAF's own records. The aircraft itself was hidden away. Its mission, a stunning success, was buried under layers of classification so deep that even most senior officers in Bomber Command remained unaware of what had been achieved. The story of the lone British jet that had humiliated the entire Soviet air defense network became a whispered legend in certain intelligence circles, but to the world, it never happened. But in Moscow, its impact was immediate, tangible, and terrifyingly loud. The silent flight of the Sky Serpent had detonated a strategic earthquake within the Soviet military-industrial complex. The initial shock and fear curdled into a relentless, state-directed fury. The presidium of the Supreme Soviet signed decrees. The KGB leaned on its scientific advisors. Design bureaus were summoned and given impossible deadlines. The message from the top was clear: close the gap. At any cost. The result was a frantic, almost panicked, acceleration of Soviet interceptor development. The existing MiG-19 was recognized as hopelessly outclassed. What emerged from the design bureaus over the next 5 years were not just new aircraft, but physical manifestations of the Soviet Union's fear. They were brute force answers to an elegantly terrifying question. The Sukhoi Su-9, codenamed Fishpot by NATO, was the first tangible result. A large, all-weather interceptor, it was essentially a missile carrier with a pilot, designed to be vectored by ground control to the approximate location of a high-flying intruder and fire its weapons upward. It was a stopgap, a desperate attempt to put something in the air that could theoretically reach the altitude of the Phantom British jet. Next came the Yakovlev Yak-28P, Firebar. A twin-engine supersonic interceptor, it was more sophisticated, but it still represented a philosophy of reaction, not domination. It was chasing a performance envelope that had already been demonstrated as insufficient. But the ultimate expression of this fear, the pure, unadulterated embodiment of the Soviet response, was the Mikoyan-Gurevich MiG-25, NATO codename, Foxbat. It was a monster. Conceived in direct response to the Sky Serpent's provocation in the American A-12 Oxcott program it had foreshadowed, the Foxbat was a weapon of pure desperation. Built not from aluminum but from heavy, heat-resistant nickel-steel alloy to withstand the friction of sustained Mach 3 flight, it was a sledgehammer. Its huge, powerful radars could burn through electronic clutter at vast ranges. Its massive R-40 missiles were designed to kill the highest-flying, fastest-moving targets imaginable. It was an incredible, awe-inspiring machine, but it was born from a position of weakness, not strength. It was a defensive panic attack made manifest in titanium and steel. Every MiG-25 that rolled out of the factory was a direct, if delayed, consequence of that single British flight. And what of the British prototype, the catalyst for this global shift? The Sky Serpent never flew an operational mission again. Its purpose had been served. It was a question mark that had been answered, a key that had unlocked a door and was then discarded. The technology it pioneered was studied, its data poured over, and then it was quietly retired, its components likely scattered and destroyed to prevent reverse engineering. It never saw combat. It never dropped a bomb. It never fired a shot. It didn't need to. Its victory was more complete than any dogfight triumph or bombing raid. It had reshaped an entire superpower's defensive posture, redirected the flow of billions of rubles, and dictated the design philosophy of a generation of Soviet warplanes. It had won a battle of perception, proving a possibility that the Soviet High Command had never seriously prepared for, that their vast, heavily fortified territory could be violated with impunity. The story of the Sky Serpent is a testament to a different kind of warfare. Sometimes a war doesn't change when a weapon is used in anger. Sometimes it changes the moment a future weapon, a mere hint of technological possibility, shows up as a fleeting, incomprehensible blip on an enemy's radar screen. The Cold War was a conflict fought as much in laboratories and on drawing boards as it was in the skies over Vietnam or the streets of Berlin. And in one of its most decisive, yet utterly silent, engagements, a single British prototype, flying for just a few minutes at the edge of space, had forced a superpower to look up in fear and rewrite its entire conception of security. The war was changed not by a bang, but by a whisper from the stratosphere.